People see me today and think my life started with success, with companies, with money, with power. But that isn't true at all, because long before rockets or electric cars, my life began in quiet rooms, long hours alone, and a feeling that I never fully belonged anywhere. Even as a child growing up in South Africa, I felt different. Not in a way that made me special, but in a way that made me isolated, because I didn't understand people the way others seemed to. I didn't connect easily. And while other kids were building friendships, I was building worlds inside my mind, reading constantly, escaping into science fiction because those stories made sense to me in a way reality didn't. They spoke about futures, about purpose, about saving worlds, and somewhere along the way I began to feel that life wasn't just something to live, it was something to solve, but that mindset came with a cost, because being different made me a target. I was bullied, pushed, beaten, humiliated, and there were moments when the loneliness felt physical, like a weight on my chest. Moments when I learned that silence could be safer than speaking, that distance could protect you, and those lessons never really left me. Even when I moved across continents, chasing opportunity, chasing education, chasing a future that felt bigger than the one I was given, and when I arrived in North America, I thought things would change, that intelligence would finally be enough, that ideas would be valued, but I quickly learned that loneliness doesn't disappear just because your surroundings change. It follows you if it has already shaped you. And as I started building companies, not for wealth, but because genuinely believed humanity needed them, I found myself once again alone with my thoughts, making decisions no one else wanted to make, taking risks no one else was willing to take. And the thing people don't tell you about leadership is that it isolates you, because once you be responsible for outcomes that affect thousands, even millions, you can't fully lean on anyone else. You can listen, you can consider, but ultimately the burden rests on you, and that weight slowly pushes people away, not intentionally, but inevitably. And as PayPal succeeded and failed relationships followed quietly behind the scenes, I started to realize that success doesn't bring closeness. It creates distance, because people begin to see what you represent rather than who you are. And when I founded SpaceX and Tesla, the isolation intensified, because now it wasn't just money on the line, it was belief, it was credibility, it was the future of entire industries. And I spent nights sleeping on factory floors, watching rockets explode, watching timelines collapse, watching critics line up to predict my failure. And in those moments, there was no crowd, no applause, no validation, just me, exhausted, questioning whether the sacrifices were worth it, questioning whether I was asking too much of myself and of the burr, opal around me. But the mission never allowed me to stop, because once you see how fragile the future is, you can't unsee it, and you can't walk away just because it hurts. And the hardest part wasn't the work or the risk. It was the emotional distance that grew between me and everyone else. Because when your mind is always focused on problems years ahead, it's difficult to stay present, difficult to nurture relationships, difficult to slow down enough to be understood. And over time, I realized that I had built a life where I was surrounded by people but rarely truly connected to them, admired but not known, trusted for my decisions but not for my vulnerability. And while the world began calling me a visionary, a genius, a disruptor, inside I still felt like that quiet kid who learned early on that if you want something done, you have to do it yourself. And that belief, while powerful, is also incredibly lonely, because it leaves little room for comfort, little room for softness, and almost no room for rest. And as I moved closer to the top, I noticed something most people never talk about, that the higher you go, the quieter it becomes, because fewer people can relate to your problems, fewer people can offer genuine understanding, and fewer still can be trusted without an agenda. And so you learn to carry everything internally, the pressure, the fear, the responsibility, the doubt. You tell yourself it's temporary, that once the next milestone is reached, things will feel lighter, but they rarely do, because there is always another crisis, another challenge, another reason you can't slow down. And somewhere along that journey, without realizing, you trade pieces of your emotional life for progress, connection for impact. And while the world sees strength, what they don't see is the cost of constantly standing alone, making decisions that could Either change history or end everything you've built. And this is where my story truly begins, not at the peak, not with success, but with the quiet realization that the path to changing the world is one you often have to walk by yourself. As the years went on and the companies grew larger, the loneliness didn't fade the way people assume it does when success arrives. It intensified because with every new responsibility came a deeper sense that there was no one else who could truly carry the weight I was carrying. And when SpaceX was on the verge of collapse, when Tesla was weeks away from running out of money, I remember feeling a kind of pressure that is difficult to explain unless you've lived it. A pressure that isn't just financial or professional, but existential, because failure didn't just mean losing companies. It meant losing belief, losing momentum, losing the chance to prove that humanity could still take bold steps forward. And in those moments, I couldn't share the fear openly, not with employees who needed confidence, not with investors who needed reassurance, and not even with the people closest to me. Because when you're the one everyone looks to for answers, you learn very quickly that showing doubt can feel like betrayal. And so I carried it alone, night after night, sleeping in factories, replaying decisions in my head, questioning whether I had pushed too hard, whether I had asked too much of others, whether the mission justified the personal cost. And the truth is, during those years, my life narrowed, relationships suffered, conversations became transactional, time became something I spent only where it felt absolutely necessary. And while people on the outside saw intensity, drive, and ABR ambition, what they didn't see was the emotional isolation that comes from never being able to fully shut your mind off, from always being the one who has to think 10 steps ahead while the present quietly slips past you. And I began to realize that leadership at this level isn't just about making decisions. It's about absorbing pressure so others don't have to. And absorbing pressure for long enough changes you. It hardens parts of you. It makes you more guarded, more distant, because vulnerability feels like a liability when so much is at stake. And as Tesla scaled and SpaceX finally began to succeed, I expected some sense of relief, some emotional release, but instead, the expectations only grew heavier because success raises the bar, it doesn't lower it, and suddenly every mistake felt magnified, every word scrutinized, every decision debated by millions of people who didn't know the context, didn't see the sleepless nights, didn't feel the responsibility of knowing that if you miscalculated, thousands of jobs and years of progress could vanish, and that constant judgment creates a kind of emotional isolation that is difficult to escape. Because even when surrounded by people, you feel fundamentally alone in your perspective, alone in the knowledge of how fragile everything truly is. And there were moments when I questioned whether this path was sustainable, whether it was possible to change the world without losing yourself in the process. But stopping never felt like amber option, because once you take on a mission larger than your own happiness, you don't get to prioritize comfort anymore, and that realization can be both empowering and deeply painful, because it means accepting that parts of your emotional life will always come second. And over time, I noticed how rarely I allowed myself to feel fully present, how often I stayed in problem-solving mode even during moments that were supposed to be personal, and that distance didn't come from lack of care. It came from an overwhelming sense of responsibility, a feeling that if I relaxed for even a moment, something important might break. And when people say the top is lonely, they often think it's because of ego or power. But the real reason is simpler and harder to admit. It's lonely because you're constantly carrying things you can't put down, things you can fully explain, things that would only burden others if you tried to share them. So you learn to internalize stress, to normalize exhaustion, to treat emotional isolation as part of the job. And while the world applauded milestones and breakthroughs, inside I was often just trying to hold everything together long enough to get to the next one. And there were days when the pressure felt unbearable, when the thought of failure felt personal, almost moral, as if letting the mission fail would mean letting humanity fail in some small way. And that kind of thinking doesn't leave much room for peace. And yet I kept going, not because I was fearless, but because fear became familiar, because loneliness became familiar, because when you've lived with isolation long enough, it stops feeling like something to escape and starts feeling like something you simply endure. And this was the phase of my life when I truly understood that being at the top isn't about enjoying success, it's about surviving responsibility, and that survival often happens quietly, internally, without recognition, without relief, and without anyone fully seeing what it costs. At some point, after years of pressure, after the chaos settled just enough for silence to creep in, I began to understand that loneliness wasn't something I was passing through. It was something I had built my life around, not intentionally, but as a byproduct of choices made again and again in favor of progress. And that realization didn't come with regret so much as clarity, because when you dedicate yourself to missions that stretch across decades, across planets, across generations, you start to see your own life differently. You stop measuring it in moments of comfort or happiness and start measuring it in impact, in whether the work moves humanity even slightly forward, and that perspective changes how you relate to everything, including people, because relationships require presence, emotional availability, and time has always been the one thing I've felt I never truly had, not because it wasn't there, but because it always felt spoken for by something bigger. And as I grew older, as the world grew louder around my name, I noticed how rarely anyone asked who I was beyond the work, beyond the headlines, beyond the controversies. And part of that is my fault, because I learned long ago how to compartmentalize, how to put emotion aside in order to function, how to keep moving forward even when parts of me were exhausted. And that skill, while necessary, also created distance. Because when you train yourself to suppress vulnerability, you also suppress connectio. And I've spent many nights reflecting on that trade-off, wondering whether it had to be this way, whether there was a version of this life where ambition and emotional closeness could coexist. But the truth is, I don't know, because this is the path I chose. And choices compound. They shape you slowly until one day you realize you become someone who is very good at carrying weight, but not very good at setting it down. And even now, with achievements behind me that many people dream of, I don't feel a sense of arrival, because there's always more to do, more risk, more responsibility, and that constant forward pull leaves little room for stillness. And yet, in rare quiet moments, I feel something close to acceptance, and understanding that loneliness doesn't always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means focus, sometimes it means clarity, and sometimes it means you are standing in a place few others can stand without losing their footing. And I've come to realize that being alone at the top isn't about isolation from others as much as it is about proximity to consequence. Because when your decisions ripple outward in massive ways, the emotional distance becomes a form of protection, not just for you, but for everyone else. And that doesn't make it painless. It just makes it necessary. And I think about how history will remember me, how people will argue about my words, my choices, my flaws. And that doesn't trouble me as much as it once did, because legacy is not something, you control. It's something others construct long after you're gone. And the only thing you truly own is your intent. And my intent has always been rooted in belief that humanity can be better, can reach further, can survive its own limitations. And that belief has carried me through moments of doubt so deep they felt physical, moments when the loneliness pressed in so tightly that it felt like there was no space left for anything else. And yet, even in those moments, I never felt completely lost, because purpose has a way of anchoring you, even when everything else feels unstable. And I've learned that loneliness at this level isn't cured by company. It's eased by understanding, by knowing why you're here and what you're willing to endure to stay on course. And I don't tell this story to ask for sympathy or admiration, but to be honest, because behind every headline, behind every breakthrough, there is a human cost that rarely gets acknowledged. And if there is one thing I hope people take from my journey, it's not that success is lonely, but that meaningful work often requires sacrifices that don't show up on balance sheets or timelines. Sacrifices that live quietly inside you, shaping how you see the world and shaping how the world sees you. And I've accepted that I may always be somewhat alone in my thinking and my priorities, in my willingness to take risks others would avoid. And that's okay, because loneliness, when paired with purpose, becomes something else entirely. It becomes resolve. It becomes endurance. It becomes the ability to keep going when comfort would have told you to stop. And as I stand here, not at the end, but somewhere along the journey, I don't see myself as a man who lost something in pursuit of greatness. I see myself as someone who made a choice to carry weight so that others might one day walk lighter. And that choice, while isolating, is one I would still make because some paths are not meant to be crowded and some heights are not meant to be shared. And standing alone at the top doesn't always mean you have no one. Sometimes it simply means you're holding a vision that hasn't reached everyone else yet.